Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, we cover the big, bad daddy of the Santa Cruz killers. And when we say big, we mean most literally. For he was 6'9", 285-pound giant of a man, but with the heart of a sad and lonely little boy. We are, of course, talking about Big Ed Kemper. He would be one of the first to define the modern serial killer, being studied by the FBI's Robert Ressler, who would later coin the actual term serial killer after extensive interviews with Ed. Big Ed was a necrophile and cannibal who killed with guns, knives, hammers, ropes, and even his bare hands, becoming known as the Chopper, the Buzzsaw Butcher, and the Coed Killer. Ladies and gentlemen, strap in. Get ready for one hell of a ride as we delve into the deeply disturbing life of Edmund Emil Kemper.
Let's begin. Prologue. It's not funny, Ed. Quit messing around. In the spring of 1973, Big Ed was well known to the police in Santa Cruz, California. He was what they called a cop groupie. He'd hang out at the same bar they all went to, the Jury Room, located right in front of the courthouse, pestering them for details about the recent blight of murdered college girls, laughing and making grim jokes.
The cops all saw the awkward and bespectacled 6'9" guy as a sweet fellow, if an odd duck, and a bit of a dork. Gentle giant was the term most used. So on April 24th, 1973, when Big Ed called the Santa Cruz Police Department in the middle of the night to confess his crimes, having driven for days nonstop into Colorado, no one at the police station took him seriously. They thought he'd had one too many beers at the Jury Room and was making some kind of sick joke, considering his call a stupid prank.
Santa Cruz Police Department.
Is Lieutenant Scherer there?
Who is this?
I'm not going to tell you, but I have to talk to him, and this is no bullshit.
He'll be in at 9.
Andy, it's me, Ed Kemper. Can you call him? This is no prank. I want to talk to him about the Coed killings.
What was the phrase you just stated?
The Coed killings? You know what I mean. Andy, I'm the Chopper. I'm the Butcher, the Coed killer. I killed my mother and her best friend, and I killed those college girls. I need to talk to Lieutenant Scherer.
I can't wake up the lieutenant right now, Ed.
I'm about 2 inches from doing a whole bunch of things, you know? I want to talk to him.
You're gonna have to call back in the morning, Ed.
This was insane. Ed ran through his options in his mind. He had an arsenal in his car, including 200 rounds of ammunition. He could go to higher ground, engage in a full-on shootout with the police. Suicide by cop. But it would be painful and scary. He paced back and forth, running scenarios through his mind, none of them looking good. Finally, he decided to call his police friends in Santa Cruz back and somehow convince them to let him talk to the lieutenant, only to find he had no more change for the payphone. His hand shook with frustration as he called the operator and tried to put a collect call through.
Operator,
Collect call to Lieutenant Scherer at the Santa Cruz Police Department, please.
One moment. Santa Cruz Police Department. Collect call for Lieutenant Scherer? Lieutenant Scherer's not here. He will not be here until 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Can I please talk to him?
I can't accept collect calls. If you want to contact Lieutenant Scherer, like I stated, he will be in tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
Wait a minute. I'm the killer. I murdered my mother.
Edmund Kemper was stunned. No one would believe him. He'd been so terrified of getting caught, and now he couldn't even turn himself in. And the terrible truth was he had killed those college girls, as well as his mother and her friend.
Big Ed had decapitated his own mother, using her face as a dartboard, but still hearing her nagging voice echoing in his head. He'd shoved her vocal cords down the garbage disposal. Though they'd been so tough, they leapt back out at him. But that was Mother, wasn't it? She always had to have the last word. But Ed had the last laugh at the end, having sex with her headless corpse in her own blood-soaked bed. The ultimate defilement.
Frustrated to the point of exasperation, he crawled into the back seat of his car, screaming, beating on the seat, unraveling mentally. He considered just taking one of his guns and shooting at passersby. That'd get someone's attention. He'd been up for days driving, but he couldn't sleep, wound too tight. So he sat in the back seat of his rent-a-car, watching out the window as the black of night grew gray and amber with dawn.
At the first rays of morning light, he started up his car and began to drive, pressing the accelerator to the floor, going nearly 100 miles per hour, swerving, driving in the wrong lane, searching for a patrol car police station, but finding only an old, dilapidated phone booth. He went to a gas station, got change, then called, yet again.
Santa Cruz Police Department.
I'm calling long distance for Lieutenant Scherer.
He's not here right now. Are you the one who called last night? What did you want to talk to him about?
Coed killing.
What?
Coed killing.
Coed killing?
The Coed killings, you know.
Yeah, where are you?
Pueblo, Colorado. I want the police over here.
What's the address? Is it a home address?
No, I live in Santa Cruz.
Are you in Santa Cruz right now?
No, I'm in Colorado. I'm at a payphone.
What's your name?
Ed Kemper. I've been driving for 3 days steady. I'm having a nervous breakdown right now.
What kind of car are you driving?
I rented it in Reno.
What kind is it?
It's a green 73 Chevy Impala. What I wanted to talk about, there were 8 people.
8 people involved?
No, there's 8 people dead.
Hey, Ed, while we're talking to you, we're gonna have somebody come over and get you.
Yeah, I wish to shit you would, really, because I have over 200 rounds of ammo in the trunk and 3 guns. That's why I was blowing it last night, and those goddamn cops told me to call back this morning at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, they probably just tried to piss you off, which they shouldn't do.
What I'm saying is, I'm teetering between saying, fuck you guys, and running off, just blow it. Or I'm trying to stop all this bullshit, man. Damn it!
Okay, just calm down, okay? Can you tell me about the killings?
You want to know the details? That's what I wanted to tell Scherer, because he'd know I wasn't talking crazy if I gave him some details.
All right, tell me.
Okay, Rosalind Thorpe. She had some clothing on her, a black pair of felt bell-bottoms and panties.
What about Shaw?
Shaw?
Cindy Shaw?
I'm telling you, there's 6 of them. And on Sunday there were 2 more, my mother and a friend of hers.
Have they been found yet?
No, that's why I was calling last night, and those goddamn cops told me to call back this morning.
How did you kill your mother?
With a hammer.
As Edmund Kemper told police in Santa Cruz where they could find the body of his decapitated and sexually mutilated mother, crammed into the closet of her duplex with the body of her best friend, the twirling red and blue lights of a police cruiser lit up the phone booth, and a Colorado police officer, gun drawn, demanded he drop the phone and leave the booth.
Edmund Kemper dropped the phone and left the booth, his towering height dwarfing the officer, who began to shake uncontrollably in fear, holding him there at gunpoint until backup arrived. The arriving officers all saw how badly the officer was shaking, and later teased him mercilessly about it.
Soon the Santa Cruz district attorney and several police officers were on a plane flying to Colorado, all of them wondering who Ed Kemper, whom they'd seen as a dorky, gentle giant, really was.
Soon, the world would find out.
Chapter 1. Little Guy Kemper. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California. He was the middle child and only son, born to Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper and Edmund Emil Kemper Jr.
To differentiate little Ed from his namesake father, the family called him by the nickname Guy.
Like many of the killers we've covered from the horrible golden age of serial killer slayings, Ed's father was a World War II veteran, a sergeant who'd actually been a Special Forces combat fighter, who'd gone on and survived literal suicide missions, and would later proudly show his only son the medals he'd been awarded, the weapons he'd used, and teach his son the many ways to take a human life that the military had taught him. After the war, he tested nuclear weapons at Pacific Proving Grounds in the Marshall Islands, before returning to California and becoming an electrician.
The Kempers were big people. Ed's father was 6'8", and his mother was 6 foot. Ed had been a 13-pound baby and towered over the other children in school growing up, later saying it always made him feel like an outcast.
And the Kempers? Well, the Kempers were a deeply, deeply unhappy family.
Ed's mother, Clarnell, drank heavily and was prone to fits of rage, where the 6-foot-tall, 200-pound woman would drunkenly scream at the top of her lungs, berating her husband and calling him a failure for becoming a lowly electrician. And quick aside, there is nothing lowly about being an electrician at all, in any way, noble profession.
As Ed's father would say,
suicide missions in wartime and atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her.
Ed's father would often spend long periods away from the unhappy home, and in 1957, when Ed was 9 years old, his father left for good and never came back. Ed would suffer abandonment issues over this the rest of his life, and blame his mother, later saying,
I wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old. I'm not proud of that.
Clarnell then packed up and took Ed and his 2 sisters to live in Montana.
Growing up, little Ed was in many ways the blueprint of the 1970s serial killer. World War II veteran father who taught him how to kill and glorified violence. Cruel and overbearing mother. Early parental breakup. Severe abandonment issues. It was the perfect storm, and as we'll see, it only got worse. Much worse.
When Ed was a little boy, he saw a puppet show where an executioner used a guillotine to slice off heads. This fascinated Ed to no end, and decapitation would become a lifelong obsession.
From a very young age, Ed was both a target of his mother's abuse and a source of her fear. Ed's older sister, Susan, was 6 years older than him, and his younger sister, Alan, was 3 years younger than him. And honestly, Ed was morbid and strange from a very young age. At just 8 years old, he confided to his sisters that he wanted very badly to kiss the elementary school teacher. But he thought the only way that would be possible would be to kill her first. His sisters then tattled to their mother that Ed wanted to kill his teacher so he could kiss her.
So Ed sought revenge on his sisters by mutilating their Barbie dolls. First, he decapitated the dolls, but having read Dick Tracy comics, he knew police identified victims by their fingerprints. So thinking himself a master criminal, he cut their hands off as well. Ed also began saying he had the power to turn living girls into dolls.
All of this was obviously a red flag, but instead of trying to talk to her son, give him the extra love he obviously needed, or seeking out psychiatric help, Clarnell instead banished him to the basement where she'd lock him in at night, saying she feared him and what he might do to his sisters.
The basement was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen and was a dark, granite-walled and windowless cell of a place lit by a bare light bulb, the stuff of nightmares and horror movies. Ed slept on a small cot in a sleeping bag, listening to the sound of rats scurrying about, staring into the eerie glow of the furnace, which he saw as the fires of hell, and would later say,
"My mother and my sisters would go to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed. But now I had to go down to the basement. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell. They're going to heaven."
He was just 8 years old, and when Ed, quote unquote, sniveled about having to sleep in the dark, dank basement, his drunken 6-foot-tall mother would smack him in the head, leading young Ed to have violent fantasies about killing her.
Feeling guilty about these violent fantasies, Ed would play a game with his sisters called Gas Chamber. Ed would pretend to be a convicted killer, and his sisters would play executioners, leading Ed to a chair where he would be strapped in, either dying of gas or being electrocuted, his body seizuring and trembling in pretend agony until he died for his sins.
One of Clarnell's relatives had a son who, oh, shame of shames, was revealed to be gay. While today this would be seen as perfectly normal, in the 1950s this was as scandalous as can be. And the family all said it was because the boy had grown up too soft and had been coddled. So Clarnell, determined to make sure her troubled son didn't turn out gay and shame the family, decided to toughen him up by heaping on abuse and trying to make a man out of him.
Of course, young Edmund Kemper was not gay in any way, but he was beginning to harbor a pathological hatred of women, which this treatment surely inflamed.
Clarnell would even reward her daughters for tormenting their brother to toughen him up. Ed began to actually pray that both his sisters and his mother would die, then began to pray that everyone in the world would die as well, going to church and sitting at the pew, head down, hands wrapped in prayer, pleading with God.
"Please, God, kill everyone on this earth, please. Thank you, Eddie."
When Ed was 13 years old, his mother married again, this time to a 45-year-old plumber. The man tried to bond with Ed, or Guy, as he was known to everyone, taking him out hunting and fishing, but Ed was uncommunicative and already deeply troubled.
Ed says that on one of the fishing trips, he just sat fantasizing about beating the man's head in with an iron bar so he could steal his car and drive out to be with his real father, and that he came very, very close to doing just that, actually standing behind the man at one point with the iron bar poised to strike, but abandoning the plan at the last moment.
The marriage fell apart after only 18 months. As Ed grew, he began to look more and more like his father, which Clarnell saw as a constant reminder of her failed marriage, and heaped on more abuse.
Ed would later say his mother was a, quote, man-hater who took her violent hatred of my father out on me.
And Ed began to show more bizarre behavior. He would lie down in the middle of the street, causing cars to stop. When the worried drivers went to examine him to see if he was all right, he'd leap up, laughing hysterically, and run away. It's really a miracle he wasn't accidentally run over. Once, while visiting New York City with family, he attempted to leap off the Empire State Building, wanting to see what it was like to be King Kong, and had to be physically held back.
Later, Ed would say it's probably better that some children and teenagers kill themselves before they grow up, that something inside them understood the dark path they were on, and they were actually sparing society with their suicides.
Ed's bizarre behavior grew darker and darker and darker. He killed the family's Siamese cat, burying the screeching creature alive. Days later, he went and dug the poor feline up, cut off its head, and put it on a spike like an Egyptian god and prayed to it.
Psychologists would later say that perhaps burying the cat alive reflected Ed's anger at being locked in the basement at night, where he was buried alive, and digging up the cat was symbolic of him being freed from his dungeon each morning. I mean, I don't fucking know. I just know this is some disturbing red flags.
That's for sure. Ed would go on to kill 3 of the family cats, attacking one with a machete and cutting off its head because he thought the creature preferred his sisters to him. He put the animal's freshly cut head on a platter and hid the body in his closet. Hiding bodies in closets would become a habit of his.
For these horrible transgressions, Ed's drunken mother would beat him savagely with a belt, buckle side out, warning him not to scream and alert the neighbors.
Ed would later say,
My mother was there to beat me. She was there to humiliate me. She was there to use me as an example of how inferior men were.
His older sister Susan, too, sought to punish Ed for killing the family cats, once trying to push him into the path of a moving train, another time shoving him into the deep end of the pool, knowing the huge, awkward, lumbering boy couldn't swim. But Ed, flailing away, somehow made it to the edge and safety.
Ed then began to take his desire to kill outside the family, shooting a neighbor's dog. When the neighborhood kids heard about this, they chased him down and attacked him, and the police had to be called to quell the scuffle.
Ed would later say about his teen years,
I always felt like a social outcast. I never managed to find my place. I was disobedient and I didn't work much. I remained locked in the basement with my dark thoughts. I became interested with everything related to morbidity. I was fascinated by lots of things that revolved around death, destruction, and evil with a capital E.
When he was just 14, it came to the point where Ed was filled with an overwhelming desire to kill his drunken, abusive, violent mother, whom Ed also thought was incredibly ugly. Feeling if he didn't immediately abandon ship, he'd act on his murderous impulses. He decided to run away.
So, on Thanksgiving Day, 1963, Ed stole his mother's car and drove out to Butte, Montana, then hopped a bus to Los Angeles to see his father.
Ed was delighted when his father said he could live with him for a while. But Ed's father's second wife, a gorgeous German blonde woman, was not thrilled with the arrival of his hulking namesake son, who would just stare at her blankly. probably thinking how much he'd like to murder her so he could have sex with her corpse. She would say his very presence gave her migraines. And a little over a month later, the family went to Guy's grandparents, Ed Kemper Sr., 72, and Maud, 66, who lived on a farm in North Fork, California, in the Sierra foothills. And Ed's father abandoned him there. When Ed later went to call his father, he discovered he had changed his phone number to an unlisted number.
Meanwhile, Ed's mother called his father and told him,
"Guy is a really funny bird. You're taking a risk by leaving him with your parents. You may be surprised to wake up one morning to learn that they have been killed."
But Ed's father hoped that rugged farm life would reform his son and instill country values. Ed's grandfather, Ed Kemper Sr., had been a cowboy, a wrangler, and it was hoped that his grandmother would become the loving mother figure Ed had been missing. Ed was given a hunting dog whom he loved, named Ankh, and a .22 pump hunting rifle, and Ed loved the shit out of that rifle.
Often on farms, varmints and rodents have to be killed, as they'll destroy crops and devour livestock feed. So his grandparents would pay Ed 25 cents for every rabbit he killed, and a dime for every gopher. Ed rigged the .22 pump rifle so it would hold 17 rounds. And as he said,
"I could just hold the trigger down and pump as fast as I could fire. I could kill a rabbit at 50 feet firing from the hip. Not with one shot, but a barrage. And he's dead."
The problem was, Ed started killing everything and anything that crossed his path. Lizards, squirrels, chipmunks, and especially birds. He says it got so that birds would circle past the property and not dare to enter.
And his grandmother was enraged over how he'd kill all the songbirds, which she adored. And eventually, she took the rifle away from him, which led to a smoldering resentment in the teen, who now saw his grandmother as just like his own mother, a bitter, haranguing woman.
Maud didn't want Ed going out either, saying that all the teenagers in the dirt-poor farming community were delinquents and bad influences.
She also forbade him from seeing movies, reading comic books, watching cartoons, even reading the funny section of the paper, and cut him off from his favorite television show, Weird Tales.
Ed began to see his grandfather as senile and henpecked. Ed thought his grandmother was overly masculine and would try to emasculate him, making him sweep the floors and do the dishes, which he saw as feminine jobs, while she would do the more traditional male chores on the farm. He would later say about his grandmother,
"She had more balls than any man and was constantly emasculating me, and my grandfather to prove it. I couldn't please her. It was like being in jail. I became a walking time bomb."
Ed began to fantasize about killing his grandmother.
One day, when everyone was gone, Ed sat imagining his grandmother was in the outhouse, as he says, taking a shit. And then he shot the living hell out of that outhouse.
Ed's grandmother was a writer. Interestingly, she wrote wholesome tales of adventurous boys for Boys' Life magazine. I suppose this is the mold she was trying to create for Eddie, a rugged outdoor life of hiking in nature. On August 27, 1964, Maud was pecking away at the typewriter, writing the final revision to a story called Fire in the Cannon. Ed Sr. had gone to town to buy groceries, and little Eddie was outside with his dog and his rifle, which he'd recently convinced his grandfather to let him have again, stalking rabbits. Ed turned and looked toward the house, and there, through the screen door, he could see his grandmother with her back to him, hunched over the typewriter, working on her manuscript.
Eddie then lifted the .22 rifle to his shoulder, lined the sights with the back of the elderly woman's head, took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. the round smashing through the screen and into the old woman's head.
Maud slumped forward as Eddie pumped another round into the rifle and fired again into her head. Then pumped and shot again, this time into her back. As Ed would describe it,
I ran into the house to see what I'd done. There was blood from the right nostril like a faucet. One eye was open, one shut. I dragged her into the bedroom. I got a knife, stabbed her 3 times.
when later asked why he'd stabbed her, he claimed he didn't know if she was dead or not and didn't want her to suffer.
He'd later say the murder was completely unplanned, just sporadic, and that after she was dead, he thought about undressing her, just to see what a woman's body looked like naked, but then felt ashamed and did not, instead dragging her into the closet as he'd done with the cats he'd killed as a child.
Then Eddie's grandfather was pulling up. Eddie says he loved his grandfather, didn't want to kill him, but also didn't want him to see what he'd done to his wife of 55 years, so he thought it best to just kill the old man.
He went outside, ostensibly to help his namesake grandfather carry groceries inside, and when the old man turned his back to him, Eddie shot him in the back of the head, then dragged his corpse into the garage.
Not knowing what to do, Eddie then called his mother and told her what he'd done.
Just weird if you think about it. Part of me wonders if he called his mother just to gloat. Look what I did. Wish it was you.
Eddie's mother called the local sheriff, and just to show you how rural and remote this ranch is, the sheriff got lost going there, had to ask neighboring ranchers for directions. It took them over 2 hours to finally find the place.
When the sheriff arrived, Ed was calmly sitting on the porch steps. When they asked him what happened, he simply said, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma."
Eddie's mother then called his father, telling him how Eddie had murdered his father and mother and saying, "I told you so."
Chapter 2, A Tuscadero.
Eddie, 15 years old, was arrested for the murder of his grandparents, and then placed in California's Youth Authority juvenile court system and diagnosed with schizophrenia.
At that time, schizophrenia was a catch-all term, and he would never be diagnosed that way today. He didn't hear voices. He didn't have psychotic breaks like last week's Santa Cruz killer, Herbert Mullen, who will be making an appearance. He and Eddie eventually became close acquaintances.
Edmund Kemper was what today they would call a classic antisocial personality disorder, and what in the less politically correct 80s and 90s would have been called a sociopathic, sexual psychopath, and homicidal maniac.
On December 6, 1964, Ed was placed in the Tuscadero State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a notorious place that housed freeway killer William Bonin, among others.
A Tuscadero was an adult facility for violent offenders, a large percentage of them sexually motivated crimes. The average age was 36. Edmund Kemper was 15.
This would be a literal nightmare for your average 15-year-old who would have been chewed up and spit out. But Ed, already nearing 6'6" and over 200 pounds, held his own. In fact, in many ways, he liked it there. He was given a lot of attention by the staff psychiatrists who all wanted to examine the strange teenager who'd murdered his grandparents, testing him, studying him. And Ed was found to be extremely intelligent. His IQ was 145 in the top 1% of the population, which actually, this is interesting, it surprised him. He said that he thought he had been dumb and slow his whole life. And he was like, I'm smart, really?
That's wild. Like, how do you not, know
Because
this
people were telling
seems,
you you're dumb. They're all,
yeah,
you're dumb, you're dumb, you're dumb. You just think you're dumb.
yeah, true, yeah. Well, Ed loved getting all the attention he never received from his parents, soaking up all the jargon the doctors, who were now father figures, laid on him, agreeing he was not schizophrenic so much as a borderline, histrionic, paranoid, dependent, antisocial with avoidant personality disorders, learning to tell the doctors what they wanted to hear and manipulate them. He became a model prisoner.
He took each and every class offered to him, becoming an expert in psychology himself. So much so that he was assigned to the facility's psychiatric laboratory, where he assisted in administering treatment and exams to the other patients. And he ended up fancying himself more as a doctor than a patient in the hospital. And this is really wild. He memorized 28 correct responses to psychological assessment questions so that he could take these tests and con his way to being seen as sane and rehabilitated. He knew all the answers.
And as for the lecherous sex criminals in the hospital for the criminally insane, Eddie thought they were great. He'd ask the rapists and sex offenders to tell him intimate details of their crimes. This was really his sex education. He was a teenager who'd never been with a girl before, and used these stories of violent sex as fodder for his budding fantasies, saying he would masturbate 2 or 3 times every single day.
Of course, Edmund, who is now a master manipulator, never revealed to the doctors the violent fantasies of death and rape and murder that he used as a masturbation source.
Ed would say,
Basically, I was born there, I have a lot of fond memories of the place. I grew up there.
They say there are no atheists in prison for a simple reason, because you have to be religious if you want to be paroled. So Ed would carry a Bible around with him and pretend to contemplate passages, pretty much exactly like Alex in A Clockwork Orange.
Oh, I read all about the scourging and the crowning with thorns, and I could vity myself helping and even taking charge of the cold chucking and the nailing in, being dressed in the height of Roman fashion. I didn't so much like the later part of the book, which is all like preachy talking and not the fighting and the old in and out. I like the parts where these old cahoochies cow-chuck each other and then drink their Hebrew vino and getting into bed with their wives' handmaidens. That kept me going.
Basically, Ed took all he'd learned and psychoanalyzed his own doctors, sussing out each of their motives and desires and giving them what they wanted. He could feel their urge to heal and help, their belief in rehabilitation and the effects of therapy. Ed would go to sessions where he said the violence that had dominated his life felt diminished through their care and therapy, that they'd cured him, then go back to his room where he'd lie in bed furiously masturbating to violent fantasies of death and dismemberment.
And after 5 years in the hospital, the doctors labeled him cured. And at 21 years old, Edmund Kemper was deemed fully rehabilitated and ready to join society. And on December 18th, 1969, Ed Kemper was released on parole from a Tuscadero hospital for the criminally insane.
It was the end of one of the most tumultuous years in American history. A man had walked on the moon, Woodstock had attracted nearly 500,000 peaceful hippies, and Charlie Manson had orchestrated a murder spree that shocked the world.
When Ed had been locked up, Elvis was king, and the Beatles were mop tops appearing on Ed Sullivan for the very first time. And when he got out, it was the Woodstock generation.
As Ed would say,
People my age were not talking the same language. I had been living with people older than I was for so long that I was an old fogey. When I got out on the street, it was like being on a strange planet. I missed that flower child generation. I missed the entry into Vietnam. All these kids are like aliens to me.
He went on his first date and took the young lady to see a John Wayne movie, which he says would have been cool in Montana when he was 15, but the world had changed since then. In Ed's own words,
I was just such a dork.
He got a job as a laborer with the California State Public Works Division of Highways, where he got the nickname Forklift for being able to carry 2 100-pound bags of cement, one on each shoulder.
But he didn't like working as a laborer. He wanted a job where he could use his mind. Also, one where he could dominate and control people, have a sense of authority. He dreamed of being a policeman. But to do that, he'd need to get his juvenile record sealed, a complicated task that he then set to work on.
Psychiatrists at the Atascadero Hospital had all said that Ed's mother was his trigger, that she set him off, and his grandmother had been a stand-in for her. They warned him not to live with her, but he did just that. She had just gotten divorced from her third husband and was living in Santa Cruz, working an administration job at the new university.
Why would Ed move in with his mother after all the emotional abuse he'd suffered as a child? And why would she take him in after saying she knew he was a killer and describing him as a, quote, real weirdo? Well, it was most likely trauma bonding, a psychological condition characterized by someone being drawn to another person who has experienced shared past trauma.
So Ed moved into his mother's duplex at 609A Ord Street. Immediately, there was tension, as Ed would say.
She was Mrs. Wonderful on the university campus and had everything under control. When she comes home, she lets everything down, and she's just a pure bitch.
Larnell, who still drank hard on her off hours, would harangue and drunkenly harass Eddie, telling him he was lazy and had no ambition, and also try to set him up with women she thought could straighten him out. As Ed says,
She was always trying to get me to go out with girls who were just like her, friends of hers from campus, ugly and awkward.
The tension eventually got so great that Ed moved out, living with a friend in Alameda, but he handled his money poorly, barely scraping by, often unable to pay rent, and would end up back in Santa Cruz with his mother, only to search out another place to live again.
In his ambition to be a police officer, Eddie took criminal law classes, but then discovered, to his utter dismay, that there was a maximum height restriction, and at a whopping 6'9", he was way over it.
He found himself alone and abandoned by the legal system as well. He tried to get counseling and couldn't. Remember, Governor Reagan had cut state funding for mental health. He was supposed to see a parole officer, but was unable to even do that. As he states,
I didn't have the supervision I should have had once I got out. 2 weeks after I was on the streets, I got scared because I hadn't seen anyone. I was supposed to see my parole officer every other week and his social worker the other week. I never did. Finally, I called the district parole officer and asked if I was doing something wrong. Was I supposed to go to my parole officer, or would he come to see me?
The man at the parole office answered back, "What's the matter? You got a problem? We're awfully busy with people we have. We'll get to you."
And no one ever did.
Ed bought himself a motorcycle. Not a good idea. He was awkward and bulky to begin with, and the roads in Santa Cruz County are full of twists and turns. There's huge, unforgiving redwood trees and blankets of fog.
He drove wildly and erratically and wrecked twice, breaking his arm and suffering a concussion. but he received a $15,000 insurance settlement for pain and suffering, which would be equivalent to $100,000 today. He used the money to rent his own apartment in Alameda and buy a huge 18-foot-long yellow Ford Galaxy 500, which he decked out like a police car, with a radio transmitter and a microphone.
With his shiny new car, Ed set to driving all over Northern California, getting to know his new environs, taking trips up to Berkeley, 70 miles north, and San Francisco, often picking up pretty young hitchhikers along the way, surprised that these girls would risk their lives getting in a stranger's car. As Ed says,
"At first, I picked up girls just to talk to them, just to try to get acquainted with people my own age and try to strike up a friendship."
With nothing to do, Ed would often take them wherever they wanted to go, even driving all the way up into Oregon, 300 miles away, or down to Santa Barbara, 200 miles south.
He grew his hair out, realizing that the girls trusted him more if he gave off a hippie vibe, and grew sideburns and a drooping mustache, and bought himself a fringed buckskin jacket.
He also began harboring incredibly violent fantasies of rape and murder. He thought of all the tales the sex criminals in a Tuscadero had regaled him with when he'd been an adolescent and learning the ways of sex.
And he couldn't help but notice that these rapists were always caught because the women went to the police afterwards. He vowed that if he became a rapist, which was his fantasy, he'd leave no witnesses who could turn him in. He would kill them instead. And his mind became a confused jumble of sex and death, sex and death, sex and death, to the point where the two became one and the same.
He began outfitting his car with kill kits: knives, swords, towels, blankets, garrots, ropes, belts, handcuffs, and garbage bags, all stashed in his trunk. He learned how he could jam the passenger door of his car with a tube of chapstick so it was stuck closed, offering no escape. No longer was Ed picking up hitchhikers as a means of exploring California and meeting people, trying to understand this new post-1960s world. Now each trip was a rehearsal, practice runs for the day he'd make his fantasies a reality. He'd take diversions, drive out into the forest just to judge his passengers' reactions, see how they'd take to a strange detour. As Ed says,
I'm picking up these young women and I'm going a little bit further each time. It's a daring kind of thing. First, there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We got to a vulnerable place where I could act out and I say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden. And this craving, this awful raging, eating feeling inside, this fantastic passion, it was overwhelming me. It was like drugs. It was like alcohol. A little isn't enough.
And in May of 1972, Eddie was ready to make his dark and twisted dreams come true.
Chapter 3: The Coed Killer. Edmund Kemper began actively hunting young, female hitchhikers in Northern California.
But he was methodical, meticulous, and devious, thinking his future crimes out. As Ed said,
I decided never to hunt around Santa Cruz because I lived there, especially with my criminal record. I could be considered a potential suspect.
On May 7th, 1972, Ed Kemper took a 9mm handgun he'd borrowed from his boss and drove up to Berkeley, tooling about the university, which had become famous as a radical hippie bastion.
Where Telegraph Avenue meets the university is actually where Charlie Manson met his first follower, Mary Bruner, who'd become the mother to his son.
While often seen as a 60s phenomenon, Berkeley actually has a long history of student protests dating all the way back to the 1930s, when the campus denounced the prospect of America entering World War II. And in the 50s, students angrily protested the fact that professors were required to take an anti-communist oath. By 1965, organizers were able to assemble 10,000 marchers to protest the Vietnam War.
As Edmund Kemper cruised along Ashby Avenue, he spied two pretty girls that he described as, quote, petite little dolls. Hippies with flowers in their hair and their thumbs out, holding a sign that read, Stanford. They were everything he dreamed of. Young, fresh, petite. Their names were Mary Ann Pesch and Anita Lucchesa, both only 18 years old. They were roommates and freshmen at Fresno State who traveled up to Berkeley to check out the groovy scene. And they wanted to stop by Stanford on their way back home.
Ed picked them up and was quickly able to surmise that they didn't know the area at all, and saying he knew a shortcut, took them out to a deserted road near Hayward, where he pulled over and flashed a 9mm Browning automatic pistol at them. As Ed said,
When the gun was pulled out, I launched it out. It was something that had been thought out in fantasy, acted out, felt out, hundreds of times before it ever happened.
He handcuffed Mary Ann to the seatbelt in the back seat, then led Anita at gunpoint to the trunk, forcing her inside as she begged and pleaded with him.
He then went back to Mary Ann, pressing her face down into the seat and handcuffing her hands behind her back, accidentally brushing against her breasts as he did so, and becoming incredibly embarrassed, blushing and apologizing to her. He is such a strange dichotomy.
He came to the decision that he didn't want to have sex with a living girl. It was just too much to deal with. He couldn't even brush against a living girl's breast without being overcome with emotion. As he says,
I would have loved to have raped them, but didn't have any experience at all in this area. I'd had very limited exposure to the opposite sex. This is one of the big problems I had, and one of the big things that made me so upset.
So Ed decided to kill them first and experiment with sex later.
So he slipped a plastic bag over Mary's head and attempted to strangle her with a terry cloth belt of a bathrobe he brought with him just for this purpose.
The young woman went wild, fighting and struggling, chewing her way through the plastic bag and wiggling free of the belt around her neck, which then snapped as Ed pulled on it. So Ed began to stab her. As he says,
I stabbed her on the side and the stomach once. As she turned around, I could have stabbed her through the heart, but her breasts were there. Her breast actually deflected me. I couldn't see myself stabbing a young woman in her breast. That's just embarrassing. I did everything stupid. I stabbed her all over, but it wasn't working. She didn't fall dead. They're supposed to fall dead. I'd seen it in the movies, right? But it doesn't work that way. When you stab someone, they leak to death.
David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, would say the same thing. He'd attempted to stab a woman before he started using a gun, and he too compared a stabbed person to a leaking bag of liquid.
But the truth is, you have to know where and how to stab to make it lethal. Remember, last week's Santa Cruz killer, Herbert Mullen, instantly killed both Mary Guilfoyle and Father Henry Tomei by stabbing them in the heart, as his father, a Marine trained to kill, had probably taught him. And I'm sure Ed's combat-trained World War II veteran father showed him this as well. But Ed was just too weirdly embarrassed to stab a girl in the heart because her breasts were there.
But some instinct or learning kicked in, for Ed then pulled her head back and slit her throat, cutting both her carotid arteries. As he says,
I learned the term ear to ear, what that meant, because that's the way it went.
After marveling over what he'd done, Ed went to the trunk where Anita was, thinking to himself,
Oh God, I did it. I don't believe it. Shit, I've done it. Now I gotta kill the other one.
such a nightmare. Can you imagine being in that trunk and hearing your best friend get brutally stabbed to death? Then the footsteps of that hulking giant coming closer and closer, and finally the trunk lid swinging open, and there's Edmund Kemper.
Ed describes how her lip quivered in fear, which always gets to me. Like when my kids were little, the minute their bottom lip would quiver, I was mush and would give in and do whatever they wanted. Ed says he just didn't have it in him to let her know she was about to die, and instead said to the terrified girl, Your friend got smart with me and I hit her. I think I broke her nose. You better come help.
As she began to creep out of the trunk, Ed attacked with the knife, but says the blade was so dull it didn't go through her thick overalls, just pushed her back into the trunk. He tried to slash her throat, but she held her hands up to protect herself, the knife slashing her fingers, so he began blindly stabbing and slashing, saying,
It amazed me that she was still going at it. I stabbed her in the forearms. One was so bad you could see both bones, and she saw it. I don't think it really hurt so much as it was the shock. She looked at it, and I could see the expression on her face of shock. She looked at me and said, No, stop.
As the girl began bleeding out and dying, Ed stared in fascination as she became delirious, waving her arms frantically as if to ward off blows when he was no longer stabbing her. She then just lay there moaning softly and eventually going deathly quiet.
Ed then slammed the trunk shut and had a complete panic attack, thinking he'd locked the keys into the trunk. He began to bang on the trunk lid, kicking it, desperately trying to get it open. Then in a full-on panic, he just started running, and then the gun slipped out of his waistband, and he tripped over it, tumbling to the ground. He told himself, think, just calm down and think. He reached into his back pocket, and there were the keys. He went back to the car, took Mary Ann from the back seat, placed her in the trunk with her friend, then went to the driver's seat and calmly drove off.
As he headed back to his apartment, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror, followed by the wail of a police siren. He was being pulled over. During the melee in the trunk, Anita had kicked out one of the taillights.
Ed remained perfectly calm, as really only a true psychopath can. Promised the officer he'd fix the broken taillight right away, and was then let go with a warning.
Jeffrey Dahmer got pulled over with his first victim in garbage bags in the back seat, just like this, and was also calm and polite and let go with a warning, which is just wild to think about. Like, I get pulled over, I mean, not recently, but like if I've ever gotten pulled over, you know, like, and I don't have bodies in the car, and I still freak out that these guys can have actual bodies in the car and just be like, yeah, sir, I'm so sorry. It's like wild.
I see a cop and start shaking for no reason. I'm like, why? You're not doing anything wrong. And I'm just like, ah.
I know, same.
And, you know, Ed was like really a lot like Jeffrey Dahmer. You know, he said like this is just like Dahmer. I was tired of people walking away from me. You know, he was like a lonely necrophile and cannibal. And he didn't particularly enjoy the act of killing itself. He wasn't a sadist. He just wanted a body he could use as a sexual plaything, a product killer.
Ed drove to his apartment, parked, got out of the car, and went to the trunk, where he took his knife and decapitated both girls right there. as he vividly described it.
I cut their heads off right there in the trunk. They're both beautiful, but after I got done with the knife, they weren't. They were bloody, and I mean, they were covered in blood. It was messy, and once I got into it, I got sucked in deeper and deeper. And I took their heads up to my apartment. I cleaned them up, I cleaned their hair out and posed them. I remember it was very exciting. There was actually a sexual thrill. It was kind of an exalted, triumphant thing, like taking the head of a deer or elk or something would be to a hunter. I was the hunter, and they were my victims.
Which is, if you remember, actually the opposite of what Jeffrey Dahmer said, saying he didn't keep the heads of his victims as a trophy, but out of love.
Ed says, disturbingly, he attempted to have oral sex with the decapitated heads, but their teeth hurt too much. So he decided to eat them. Again, very Dahmer.
As Ed would later say,
I cut some of the meat out of her neck. She was more of a lean type, very athletic. That was very sweet. A lot sweeter than any meat I've eaten. It was just a small chunk and I cooked it, fried. I'm not much of a gourmet cook. Well, I'd had this fantasy as a kid about swallowing an eyeball. I thought, wow, this is the rankest thing you could do. So I just swallowed it. It was all slimy, from the tissue coming out. It's kind of hard to take an eyeball out with a teaspoon, I guess it really stretches the optic nerve. Once you pull it out far enough, you have to reach behind and cut the optic nerve. Then it would come out.
what? Very much like Dahmer, he'd say he killed them not to hurt them. He didn't relish the killing, but that, quote,
I had a real problem with depriving people of their lives. It wasn't the aspect of killing them. It was the aspect of possessing their bodies afterwards. So it was almost after evicting someone from their human body. That was the only way they could be mine.
And explaining that he ate their flesh so that they could, quote,
always be a part of me.
That's so much like Dahmer. He then went back to the car saying,
I was quite attracted by Mary Ann Pesch's figure earlier and decided I was going to take her upstairs and take her clothing off and see just how well she was developed.
He wrapped her in an old sleeping bag and carried her up to his apartment.
And then sadly, I've never seen this stated like this before, but he lost his virginity to a headless corpse. I mean, that's just technically how he lost his virginity, propping the heads on either arm of an overstuffed chair so that they could watch. He then returned to his car and retrieved the body of Anita.
Wow, can't wait to have fucked up dreams tonight. He dissected the bodies, cutting off their arms and legs, having sex with the torsos while their heads watched, photographing it all with a Polaroid camera. Then crammed the bodies into his closet, hiding them just as he'd done with his sister's Barbie dolls after decapitating and butchering them, just as he'd done with the neighborhood cats he'd shot, just as he'd done with his grandmother after shooting her in the head.
The next morning, he packed all the body parts, besides the heads, into boxes and drove to Loma Prieta, the highest peak of the Santa Cruz Mountains, a stunningly beautiful place, and scattered them into the redwoods, making sure to remember where each piece was tossed so he could come back and savor that moment. And the heads, like Jeffrey Dahmer, he kept in his refrigerator.
He kept the heads as long as he could until the decay became just too much. Then he went back into the Santa Cruz Mountains, and with great remorse over losing his trophies, hurled the heads into a ravine, especially lamenting the loss of Anita's head, saying,
Sometimes afterward, I visited there to be near her because I loved her. I've had a lot of dreams about that.
Hikers would eventually stumble upon the head of Anita Pesch, which was so decomposed that authorities were unable to tell if it was male or female until blood testing was done.
Ed had hoped that the Polaroid pictures he'd taken of his savagery would satiate his bloodlust, and for a while, they did. But then the photographs began to lose their power, and the fantasies began to overwhelm him again. So he headed back to Berkeley to hunt yet again.
Chapter 4: The Buzzsaw Butcher. On September 14th, 1972, Edmund Kemper drove his yellow Ford Galaxy 500 down Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley and spotted Aiko Ku, a 15-year-old girl who had missed the bus to San Francisco for her dance lesson and was now trying to flag a ride by holding out a sign reading SF.
Ed picked the young girl up, driving over the Bay Bridge and into San Francisco, then pretending to get lost and miss the exit, and accidentally ending up on Highway 1 South. Aiko saying,
"Well, I'm late now. I'm going to be late for my class."
and Ed telling her she wasn't going to make her class that night.
When the girl asked what he meant, Ed Kemper told her,
"I'm not taking you to San Francisco. I'm taking you out of San Francisco."
Ed pulled out a Colt .357 Magnum he'd borrowed from a friend and waved it at the girl, who began to panic and scream, "Please don't kill me. Please, please, please."
Ed told her to calm down, that he wasn't going to hurt her, saying he was just deeply depressed and suicidal and needed someone to talk to keep him from killing himself.
Edmund Kemper drove 15-year-old Aiko Ku outside of Santa Cruz, up Bonnie Doon Road to a desolate area on Smith Grade Road.
He then told her he wanted to take her to his mother's house, but that he was nervous she might try to escape, so he wanted to tie her up in the back seat, asking her to hand him some tape from the glove box. The young girl did as she was asked, took the tape out, and tore a piece off, which he placed over her mouth as she smiled sweetly at him.
Aiko then got into the back seat and laid down. Eddie then got out of the car, leaving the keys in the ignition and the gun on the front seat, and went around to the passenger door, only to find the door locked.
He'd locked himself out of his car. But he doesn't panic. He just calmly tapped on the window and motioned for her to open the door, which she did.
Insane, just insane. She must have been in shock or something and just I don't know.
He said she was being really sweet and nice and trying to comply with everything he said. She was a really talented dancer too. She had danced for the United Nations when she was just 12 years old.
Oh my God. So this 6'9", 300-pound man then got into the back seat with the 5'4", 105-pound girl and tied her hands behind her back. And as he says,
I turned her over rather gently onto her back and placed my body on top of hers, placed my right hand firmly over her mouth. She looked slightly curious at this point, wondering what I was doing, not at all panicking or worried. I then took my left hand, my thumb and index finger, and pressed both her nostrils closed. And for a moment, there was actually no change in expression. Then she realized what was happening and went berserk. She completely panicked and struggled violently for what I can only imagine to be a half a minute, maybe 45 seconds, until she lost consciousness. I opened her right eyelid to see how unconscious she was, how much eye movement there was, I guess a nominal amount. It wasn't rapid. And she started her movement again. For a moment, she just looked at me. Then she remembered what was happening and went right back into the extreme panic. This time I held her nose until all of the voluntary breathing was done. I picked her up, thrust her on the ground, pulled her bass down, and forced sexual intercourse on her. It was all very quick, only 15 seconds. At that moment, I noticed she was still breathing. I took the muffler she wore, wrapped it around her neck, and choked her until I was convinced that she was dead. I suppose, as I stood there looking, I was doing one of those triumphant things too, admiring my work, admiring her beauty, and I might say, admiring my catch, like a fisherman.
Edmund Kemper then put the body of 15-year-old Aiko Ku in the trunk of his Ford Galaxy and drove to the jury room bar where he drank beers with his police friends before driving to his mother's home and testing his ability to keep cool after a murder.
He then drove back to his apartment in Alameda, boldly carried her up inside, where he dismembered her body in the bathtub, again like Dahmer, using a knife, a sword, and an axe, placing the parts in garbage bags, photographing it all, saving choice cuts of meat, saying later that when he grew lonely or depressed, he'd look at the photographs he'd taken while frying and eating parts of her.
Edmund Kemper would later say,
I wish somebody had come by that night when I cooked a casserole out of her. You know, a noodle-type casserole, layered with cheese and meat. It's one of my favorite dishes.
He kept her head but disposed of her body parts, some in the sewer of Alameda, some in the redwoods of North Rodeo Gulch Road.
2 days later, he went to Fresno to be examined by 2 psychiatrists who would determine whether his juvenile record should be sealed or not. Afraid that his nosy landlady would come and look in his refrigerator, he brought Aiko Ku's decapitated head along with him in the trunk of his car. The psychiatrist examined him for hours and stated, quote,
If I were to see this patient without having any history available, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who is free of any psychiatric illness. He has made excellent response to years of treatment. I see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or any other member of society. I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile record. And from now on, whenever I make a mistake at work, I'm going to what is the word? Oh God, fucking edit it. What am I trying to say? I'm going to
I don't know. What are you
make
trying
myself
to say?
feel.
You don't have a decapitated head in your car, do you?
I'm gonna make myself feel better about the fact that I'm not the psychiatrist who said this about Edmund Kemper. Like, there's no mistake I could possibly make at work in my writing that is equal to this grave misjudgment and good Lord.
Yep. And the murders of his grandparents were now permanently expunged from his record. Edmund Kemper had a completely clean slate. He was now free to apply to be a police officer, though sadly he'd found out he was too tall. But he could also apply to be a teacher, a child care worker, a camp counselor, be a basketball coach, whatever he wanted. The world, as they say, was his oyster. And he was also now able to go and legally purchase his own firearm.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we leave you for today. Be sure to tune in next week for our second and final episode on the story of Edmund Kemper, the Coed killer.
And we've also got a very special guest lined up to tell us about their personal experiences living through Santa Cruz's time as murder capital of the world for a bonus episode. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for listening, And if you want to reach out, we're always here. murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week for the final installment of Edmund Kemper, the Coed Killer.